Okay, so back to Genesis chapter 1. We started in the first 2.5 verses last week, looking at the prologue to this account that Moses gives, in which he states that great fact to which many of us will often appeal. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Elohim, the God of great power, created all things. And the narrative begins, as you remember, with the earth being without form and void and darkness, and the Spirit of God there. And then we saw the first great words of God speaks into all of this. Let there be light. And it reminds us again that it is God who spoke these things into existence. And one of the great things to keep in mind here, which I somewhat alluded to last week, but I want to emphasize a bit more because you'll see it as you go through the text even further, is that one of the things that Moses is doing here is giving to us an explicit rendition of the fact that there is one creator God above all things, greater than all things. He is not a material being subject to the laws of creation, but rather a God that sits outside of creation itself to make all that is substantive different from himself. And I say that because, as I've noted a couple of times, there were a number of ancient Near East and Egyptian mythologies that were running around in these days, in fact, pre-existed Moses by 1,000 years, in which the creation narratives in those mythologies were largely based on a struggle amongst the gods to take material things and turn it into something like we have it now. And Moses is writing a narrative in which he's explicitly, and you see it explicitly, even in that first phrase, that this is not a struggle between gods trying to make something. This is the one true creator God who simply says, let there be. A God who is in no way cooperating or competing with any other deities or ideas or whatever in all those various mythologies. Moses is writing an account of the history of creation from the perspective of what had been revealed by the Spirit of God of these events. This is not a mythology. This is an account of creation as Moses sees it. And I would emphasize as well, and this is without question, that Moses is clearly driving us toward a point. He's trying to get us somewhere to see, and that becomes so very obvious as you notice that his account of the days seems to get longer as you go through the narrative. Each day gets a little longer. So it starts with a quick examination of day 1, but by the time you get to day 6, it's significant in terms of how much he put. So it's clear that Moses is trying to get us to that great pinnacle of creation, which is the formation of man upon the earth, his place as the creature created in his own image, a creature unique amongst everything that was created. Having some similarities, of course, but being distinct by virtue of being created in the image of God, and more specifically, that first great commandment that you see in the 6th day. Okay? So we left off in verse 3 and into verse 4, and so God says, let there be light. And in verse 4 it says, and God saw that the light was good. Now that phrase, good, God seeing that it's good, is repeated, as you know, multiple times through this text. And it's important to remember that this is not God observing what he has created and going, that's interesting. I hadn't considered that. No. It's a phrase in which God is articulating, or Moses is putting on the lips of God here, the idea that what God has created and what he looks upon it with that satisfaction of a creator having created something as he desired it to be. It's good because it matches his intention and his purpose in it. So when God says, let there be light, and he sees that the light is good, he's looking at this thing that he's made, this light, and says, that's what I wanted. That's my intention. That's what I purposed, okay? And you will notice that there's only one place in this entire narrative where it changes from good to very good, and that's when? When he creates man. So that idea, again, by adding the adjective, the idea, the picture of it as it's painted through the text is this idea that we are rising up in this narrative to a pinnacle of what is not only good, but very good. Or not only what God had purposed to accomplish, meets all of his understandings of it, but now is even greater than that, and that it's something even more. Okay? And you'll see that as we get to day 6. So God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Now there's obviously much discussion. Could I use the word dispute? Much discussion over what exactly is being meant by these two phrases, night and day. As you know, we technically base our view of night and day upon the rotation of the earth on its axis in relationship to the sun. Our night and day is based on that. And so that has led to some discussion. Is this a depiction of night and day in that sense of the word as we use it, or is there a different sense of the word? You can ask 50 different scholars, 50 different believers, 50 different pastors, and get 50 different answers. I'm not sure. What one commentator did note about this is that what is really being pictured here in the face of this is that sense of time itself coming into play. You could make an excellent argument here that as God created the fundamental building blocks of matter, he also created the fundamental building blocks of time as a part of it. Time exists within this universe as a created thing. I think we have a hard time grasping that, don't we? We sort of assume that time simply is. But God, being infinite as he is in nature, is not bound by time, for he is not within the framework of time itself. Time is a created thing, just as much as the universe itself is a created thing. Matter and physical laws and all these kinds of things are created. They came out of the mind of God into reality as we understand reality, okay? Not as he understands it, as we understand it. And so even time itself is a part of this reality. And time is, if you know anything about quantum physics, I know very little about quantum physics, but I know a few things. And one of the things I do know is that there is a sense in which time itself is deeply embedded in the idea of matter in this world. You remember the equation that I gave you last week, Einstein's great equation regarding the amount of energy in an object, and the mass of an object, E equals mc squared. The m being the mass of the object, E is the amount of energy in it, which is determined by taking the amount of mass in the object and multiplying it by the speed of light. Speed implies time by its very definition. You measure speed in terms of its distance traveled over time. That's speed. So there's a sense in which the very fabric of the universe itself is built around not only physical matter, but time, and those things are interwoven together in such a way that they are integral to one another. It's almost as though you can't have one without the other. You have to have matter with time, time has to have matter, and so forth. Those things go hand in hand. God, being spirit, is outside of time. He's not committed to time. Now, of course, God can understand time. He created it, so he can certainly look upon the idea of a ticking clock and say, I understand past and present and future. One of the ways that I've always been fascinated, one of the things I've always been fascinated, I've used this illustration before, so I apologize for repeating myself, but philosophers have noted this. You and I, when it comes to time, have only a past and a future. There is no present. There is, but it's such a tiny slice that we don't even notice it. It's really, it's interminable. because everything that you were doing moves from the future into the past. Even the words that I'm speaking now are now in the past, and those are in the past, and now those are in the past, and those are in the past. And I'm going to say some few words in a few minutes that are going to come to you, but they're going to go into the past. Oops, there they go. Okay, so we live in a world in which we are living in a constant stream of moving from the future to the past. And yet God has no past and future. Everything is infinitely present to him. Again, explain that in human terms, you can't. There's nothing within this reality that gets you close. There have been a few experiments where they've tried to come up with that idea, but time itself is, integrated. In fact, physicists will tell you that the idea of a time machine to go back in time is a physical impossibility by virtue of the reality of time being so intermixed with matter itself. You couldn't do that. Yet at the same time, we know from quantum physics that there is a sense in which even time itself is manipulatable by virtue of our place in the universe. Einstein theorized, and his theories have actually been mostly proven true, that the faster one goes, the more time itself slows down. So that when you reach the speed of light as an object, time is no longer advancing. Now, again, they've been able to actually show that. They've actually been able to demonstrate that light does travel at different speeds in different places, in different ways. Obviously, they can only do micro examinations of that because none of us have approached the speed of light, and the fastest a human being's ever gone is the speed that we traveled to get to the moon. That's it. And that was only a tiny fraction of the speed of light. So we can't really assess it per se, but it's been proven out to be the case. Notice the point. Time and matter are joining themselves together. It could be that what the writer is doing here is giving us an introduction to this idea of us recognizing time. Even as an ancient Israelite would understand the day-by-day flow of his life across the course of a week, moving across time. Okay? I'd have you notice something in the remaining part of the verse that kind of gets overlooked. You don't really notice it unless you pay attention to it. God called the day, the light day, and the darkness called night, and there was evening and there was morning. I think if I'd have written this, I'd have written the other way around. And there was morning and there was evening. Because we have a tendency to think like that in terms of a day, don't we? A day starts at morning and moves its way towards night. However, that's how we think in the 21st century. In the 14th century, 15th century BC, when Moses was writing this, Semites actually thought the opposite, from night to day. In fact, there's much of that evidence of that in the gospel accounts. In the first century, Jews were still thinking in that way. Night's coming. The day is about to end. We need to get Jesus off the cross because when sundown comes, the day is over. Night begins the process of a new day in much of the thinking process of the Semite. And so it's very possible here that in this verse, what Moses is describing, what God is doing, is he is defining the reality of the movement of time in this universe that he's created, all of what is flowing forth in it. And so it begins. And so it begins, the movement of this universe going forward. Sometimes it's day, sometimes it's night. And if you have one of those in your house, see that little thing there? One of those little things right there? If you have one of those in your house, have you ever had one of those that gets its days and nights mixed up? Experienced that? Where he's sleeping in the daytime and up all night, and the parents are like, wait a minute, you got it backwards here, okay? All of that is fit into this world of, here it goes, time begins, okay? And so there's light, which is day, and there's darkness, which is night, and there is evening, and there is morning, and there is a day, the first day. Now, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't pause here and point out the fact that good men have differed over that last word in that verse for a very long time. And that last word is the word day. You say it in Hebrew, say it in Hebrew. Yom. Y-O-M. Yom. Good men have differed over that. What does this term mean? And I think probably the primary reason that it has come to play is a post-Enlightenment problem. Of course, we are living in a scientific age. We're trying to understand the observations that we make of the universe around us and the earth around us and the things that we see, and we're trying to understand what this term means. There have been good men who have said that this term really is more of a reflection of periods of time from God's perspective, even as you see in Psalm 90, right? One day with the Lord is like 1,000 years, kind of idea, the picture of God working through ages or periods. Now, there are some, of course, who would swing that pendulum and say, well, what that implies is that this narrative is actually eons of time, geological eons, and that will correspond, quote unquote, with the observations that we make about our world being what it is. Okay. There are others, of course, who would take the perspective that this is more of a literal term used as the term is typically used in the Old Testament, a period of 24 hours. And in fact, there were many who would look at this verse and say, God called the day the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was morning, a day. And so it's perfectly reasonable to come to the conclusion that this word in this is being used in that more literalistic sense of a period of time. Now, again, it's problematic because we base our concept of a day on the rotation of the Earth on its axis in relationship to points in space, which really doesn't come to play until we get a little further down this narrative. But that doesn't imply that God couldn't have indeed established a 24-hour block of time, which would match his framework that he will eventually put in place throughout the entirety of the creation that will follow. Because there's been days on this planet for a very long time, right? We've been measuring days and weeks since the dawn of time. That's a pun. Since the dawn of time, we've been measuring days. So there's no reason to not believe that this couldn't be just simply a period of time that matches the basic idea that we have within our framework, including the fact that all of the rhythms of this earth are based on that pattern. Your circadian rhythm, for example, is based on that idea. So we have both of those camps. You have those who would say this is long periods of time. There are others who would say, well, it's shorter periods of time, but it comes down into eon or ages. And then there's those who would go to the more sense of this is a 24-hour period. It's hard to really know the answer to that. My inclination, I'll get to your question in a second, my inclination is to take this as a more literal view of the word day here. I think I can make a pretty good case that the word yom is used far more often in that literal 24-hour type pattern than it's used in that age pattern. And I also would argue with those who say that, well, how do you account for the so-called massive age of the earth then in this short period of time that it takes God to create the world? And I would say, because as men, we don't necessarily observe our world well. Or we think we know what we're looking at, but we don't necessarily. It has been well documented through the years that many of the techniques that are used to judge age have been found to be deficient and have not actually stood the test of time. So again, it's good men who have disagreed over it. There's no room here for there's no room from these four verses, there's no room for some sort of theistic evolutionary process, is what I would argue. And I think we're talking about men who would agree that that's the case, but would still try to figure out what the word day means, okay? Theistic evolution, by the way, is the idea, or an intelligent designer idea is, well, God sort of just set everything in motion and then stood back and just let it run. to create the world. So it occurred on natural process. So it's like marrying evolution with some sort of creationary process. And Moses does seem to drive away from that. Okay, I'm sorry, Don. I needed to finish a paragraph. Mm-hmm. They take it, those who take it more in that metaphorical sense, treating it as an age or a period of time, do so from the perspective that they see night and day here not in terms of the actual passage of time, but more the metaphorical idea of time existing and moving. So they simply justify it in that way. I'm not persuaded by their argument. I think that night and day in this phrase to me means God establishing time in the way that we would understand time over time, which is day-based and then week-based, because another argument against their position is this entire narrative comes to a week, which is again another normal process by which we measure time. Every culture has had 7-day periods of understanding time through the centuries. So if you put together the word day and the week of which it's made, I think you have to come to, I think you have to come to the conclusion that it's building on this idea of ordinary time passing through the world, God creating what you and I know even today as ordinary time. I don't think so. That's a good question. As I said last week, I think this light is, to me, and again, this is just my opinion, I think this light is the building blocks of the elemental nature of things. Light energy itself, which forms all of what is. The lights that are formed in the fourth day are the lights in the heavenly expanse. So hold that thought until we get to that day, okay? Again, it's how you, as I said last week, you could go that way, yes. Okay, that's fine. Good men have done that. I'm inclined to see the water not as a metaphorical reality with God creating the very first thing in that first sentence, in that first statement. Let there be light. That's the first thing established because he speaks for the first time. So where does this water come from if he hasn't spoken it into existence? I don't believe that there's some sort of primordial sea that God worked with there that just existed. No, it can't. By definition, there has to be something. So if I take this narrative in the order it's given, to me, I would see light being the formation of the building blocks of energy itself to which all the elements are created, followed by then the creation of time in the rest of the verse and down into the next verses. The waters being a metaphorical reality of nothingness. There is God, there is no matter, there is no space, there is no time, there are no physical laws, they're just God, and the Spirit of God is brooding over this reality to then God says, let there be light. So I've always been convinced that the first words out of God's mouth are the first things that are created, the first matter that existed. Okay, so what we have now, I would argue with you, not argue with you, I would suggest to you, you will note that this text actually gets easier as you go along. And you know why? Because the things that are created are much more that we understand. Okay, so the days get longer, I mean, in terms of the narrative, okay, there's still days, but they get longer, and we become much more, it becomes much more obvious what's being talked about, with a few serious question marks over our heads as we go along, okay? We'll see that, of course, when we get to day 4. Okay, now, oh, and just one final thought on the whole day thing. Yes, I'm a young earth creationist. I don't think this world is billions of years old, because the fact of the matter is that our scientist friends who insist that the earth is 4.6 billion, is that what they say now? 4.6 billion years old is, how do you maintain the entropy of this earth for 4.6 billion years? You realize how long that is. And one of the first things you have to stop and think about is, okay, we can measure, we have measured with satellites exactly how much land is eroded each year by the lapping of the sea on the shore. Do you know how many times the continents would have disappeared in 4.6 billion years? 7 times. All of the continents themselves would have been eroded into the sea in 14.6 billion years if this earth was that old. It doesn't make sense. An additional thought was that same physicist, by the way, that came to that church to talk about that light thing, he pointed this out too. He said if the moon was 2.5 billion, which I think is the current estimate of its age from a secular perspective, when the men touched down on the moon and Neil Armstrong stepped out and stepped down on the surface, he would have stepped into 146 feet of dust based on what we know falls on the moon. We have measured it. Remember, we've been there. Now, not according to some, but we've been there. We walked on the moon. We have footprints on the moon. We know we've been there because we have objects on the moon that we can bounce signals off of. Okay. But nonetheless, he would have stepped into 146 feet of this stuff. And because there is no atmosphere and no water and no substantive forces to compact that, he would have sunk in 146 feet. So it doesn't make sense. There's a lot of analysis of this doesn't make sense. The fact is that God created the earth in a quick period of time, and he did that because he wanted to. Okay? Verse 6. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. Now, if we stop there, then we would say, well, what's he talking about? Well, he describes it next. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was this evening, and there was morning the second day. That word heaven is a difficult word in Hebrew to translate. Extraordinarily difficult word to translate. There's been much debate amongst Hebrew scholars about what that word means. Some would use it as it's translated here in the sense of the heavens. Others would translate it in the sense of that which is above or that which is greater. But it would seem that there is some sort of separation between what is above from what is below. And there have been those who would like to argue that because the word heaven is used here, again, the word itself is hard to translate, but the English word heaven would seem to imply the idea of a separation of the material world from the spiritual world. Because heaven is clearly not a physical place. And since the word is used in the singular, not the plural, so it's not heavens, it's heaven, or translated heaven. The word in the Hebrew is singular. The question is that a reference to, is that a reference to, it's not a reference to the heavens as ancient Semite people would understand it, which would be what you see above us, what we can see with our eyes above us. So this seems to be different. And so there's a sense in which some have said, okay, so what does this word mean? Well, all I would say is I think that what is being described here is in the second day, after we have God establishing this material world and all of its subordinate or component parts in the general sense, time, laws, matter. Now he begins to actually form this into something real, something where there's separation between that which is here and that which is here. All right, because we have separation, don't we? The earth is distinct from all other things, and each thing on the earth is separate from other things, so there's distinctions in there. To be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure what this word is saying, and so for me, my opinion would be simply that this is God separating the above from below, the spiritual realm from the physical realm, and it's very possible that somewhere at this point is the creation of that heavenly audience that's watching this, which is the angels, the spiritual world. We do have to account for them at some point, don't we? They do exist. We do know they exist. The Bible's loaded with references to them. We have nothing really else in our Bibles telling us when they came into being, but they did. So I would be inclined to put their existence here somewhere on the second day. And I also believe that from the perspective of what we hear in the New Testament of an audience that is watching the things of God. Paul speaks of it, I think, in Ephesians 3. What is it they're observing? They're observing God in his glory. We have words in the Psalter in which the angels, or was it Job, where the angels exalt over the creation and seeing what they're seeing. This would be the perfect spot for them to show up, for God to create them. Watch this. Watch what I'm doing. Because they are created beings and subject to the laws of this world, even though they are spiritual beings, they are subject to the laws of creation. They do exist in the created order. You have to account for them somewhere. I would put him here. That's where I would put him. So there is now, by the end of the second day, something above and something below. The waters above from the waters below. The substance above from the substance below, making a separation. So as you can see now, God is moving to actually now start taking and forming all the various final things that are coming into play as you go. Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. Yes. That would be perfectly reasonable, Don. What Don says is that this word sky, there's no mention of sky being created, but it's very possible that the distinction is between the above and below being sky above and earth below, because this word can be translated sky in some places. Absolutely. I'd forgotten that, so thank you for reminding me of that. So there's a number of different ways to understand what this is talking about, but it's clear, isn't it, from the verse that there's some sort of distinction from what's above from what's below. And so then each of these actions on the part of God is making this more specific as you go. You see, we're getting from the very what's the word, nebulous in the early verses to the very specific as you move along. And so we're seeing that go as we go through the text. And let's not forget the basic point, right? Who's doing this? God's doing this. He's doing it for his glory and his purposes. It's his decree. It's what he has intended. It's a part of his intention. And it's driving us, as you see here, it's driving us toward the creation of man at the end of this chapter. Okay? So now in verse 9, we come to the third day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. So if we assume that this picture is a picture of what's above from what's below, the what's below here is now the earth itself taking its shape of land and sea. And notice again that separation motif, separating land, dry land from sea. And so it's let the waters under the heavens be gathered together. So now under the heavens, so down in the layer below that expanse from above, then you have waters below being gathered together into one place, dry land appearing. So God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And again, God saw that it was good. So God separates there. Now, I would have you note something. I've always been convinced that God did, in fact, leave a massive expanse of water above the earth at this point. And that the basic structure of this expanse above from expanse below was a great canopy of water that sat over the earth and made the earth into um, a well, to use a term that we're familiar with, to turn it into a great greenhouse. He made the earth such that the climate inside that envelope, under that expanse of water, would have made the conditions of the earth perfect for plant and human life. Oh, well, and animal life too, right? All kinds of life. Life would flourish in such an environment. So I'm convinced that there was a great expanse of water above. And of course, it came down over Noah. And one of the side effects of this great canopy is an observation that some scientists have noted, that there seems to have been at one time a uniform temperature and climate around the entirety of this globe. They have found core samples of trees, specifically palm trees, deep in the ice of Antarctica. How do you explain that? Well, one explanation could be that the poles of this earth were just as temperate as the middle part of the earth, because the water vapor greenhouse over the entire thing would have turned this world into the perfect incubator for life. And what I mean by that is life growing in ways that we don't even understand today, because we're out from under that great canopy back in those days. I don't know if you've heard this or not, but they have been watching the earth, of course, since we have supposedly been poisoning the atmosphere with CO2, and have noticed that there's a massive greening going on this planet. There is approximately 25 to 30% more green space on the earth than there was in the 1960s. I'd explain that. Well, I would suggest to you that, yes, they're right. There is a greenhouse effect of these, although make no mistake about it, the single greatest greenhouse substance is water, not CO2. Water vapor is by far the greatest greenhouse effect. But there's been this massive greening. So there's this sense in which plants thrive greatly in an environment where they have this greenhouse. I mean, literally, we make greenhouses and grow plants in them because that's how you grow things. That's how you grow plants and ship them all over the world, right? So that's what I think this is describing. There's waters below, we call them seas, we're all familiar with those, but there's also a great expanse of water over the top. Great expanse of water over the top. And did you know that falling water that falls significantly produces great drops in temperature? Severe drops in temperature? Even to the point that you could drop a massive amount of water on a mastodon and freeze it solid in place with the leaves in its mouth that it's chewing at that particular moment, and we dig them up years later wondering, how did this mastodon get flash frozen with the leaves still in his mouth? That's how. So there's a water vapor over this thing. It also explains why men live to 900 years old. Because guess what's not falling on them as it is in our day? Ultraviolet radiation that would be filtered out by the great cloud cover over the earth, the great vapor barrier over us that would filter out all of those things. Why do you think Noah's sons lived a lot shorter lives than their grandparents? That was gone. I don't know, it's another, I've heard all of these things over the years, and so I'm just kind of spitting them out, sorry. Reptiles never stop growing, did you know that? They never stop growing. What do you think a lizard would look like if he lived 900 years? Would he look like something out of Jurassic Park? Yeah. So God separates the water, he creates land, and he gathers together the seas. Now, this day's not done, because you will notice, starting in verse 11, The day continues. This is day 3. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. So God creating all the various forms of vegetation on the earth. And as let me continue. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed. Notice the repetition of verse 11 and 12. Almost identically said twice. Each according to its kind, and God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning. What stands out to you about the description of the plants in those 2 verses? Seed, which implies reproduction. Be fruitful. That's not a play on words. Be fruitful. Bear fruit. Bring forth fruit. God, I think the picture that you have here is God saying, I'm going to create all of this once, in the sense that I'm going to speak it into existence and it's going to come, but I'm going to decree that it's going to continue of its own. It's going to continue of its own. God doesn't have to come along and say, all right, Adam and Eve are over here. Well, I'll tell you what, let me create another group of people over here and then another over here. No, I'm going to just create these and then reproduction. So you see this reproduction idea already here. Be fruitful and multiply. It's not commanded to the plants, though. Why not? Because they do it naturally. But you and I are commanded to do it. Why? Because reproduction for us is a matter of the will. Okay, we'll see that more as we get further down into the 6th day. So, once again, you have evening and you have morning. Notice again that order. You have evening and morning, which finishes the 3rd day. Okay, now, what you get from secular people who don't believe the Bible is immediately to turn to the next verses and go, ha, your creation account can't possibly be right. Because notice what comes next. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, and there'll be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth, and it was so. And God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning the 4th day. And what did they do immediately with this text? Well, how can you have plants on day 3 if you don't have sunlight until day 4? Well, because our God, the simplest answer is because our God decided that's the direction he's going to go. One could make an excellent argument building on something that Don said last week that, you know what, God does this the way he wants to, and sometimes he does things a little backwards in order to show you that this isn't done by natural means. Okay, I'm putting words in your mouth. I hope I was paraphrasing you fairly. Okay. But I think also there's a sense here in which, do I really have to be concerned about God creating plants on day 3 and not waiting until day 4 to create the sun if it's only like 12 hours later? Does it matter? No. Yes. Yes. Okay, so let me repeat myself from earlier when I said that I see night and day in those verses above being not a description necessarily of the difference between sunlight and nighttime, but the difference between time itself, moving through time. Here, in this case now, what God will do is actually establish the lights in the heavens to mark time. You'll notice it specifically does say that, doesn't it? To rule, verse 18, to rule over the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. So now he's He's taking that general idea of night and day as we would understand it and actually make it into something physical and real based on a little world that spins on its axis once every 23 hours and 57 minutes and 36 seconds. Okay? Goes around on its axis. And we mark time by the sun going down and the sun going up and the sun going down and the sun going up. Okay? So night and day in those verses up there, and by the way, in the ESV, you will notice that they actually capitalize day and night in verse 5 to indicate that they're seeing that as words different from night and day down in these verses that I just read. Time. Now, how is time measured on the earth by these things that are physically created? How are these plants, for example, going to recognize the idea of night and day? And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but plants have circadian rhythms too. Some of you who may be gardeners know that there are flowers that will pop open in the morning and then go back to sleep at night and then pop open in the morning and go back to sleep. They have rhythms themselves as well. They're part of this time frame. And so in this case, what you have are God creating the lights in the heavens. Now, I would have you notice something here. You will notice that Moses doesn't call it the sun and the moon. He calls it the greater light and the lesser light. But he does say, and the stars. So the indication would be a simple reading of the text is he's talking about the sun and the moon. Because the sun and the moon and the stars are above. We have a large moon that reflects much light upon the earth from the sun at night. We have of course, we have the sun itself that creates much light upon the earth. And then we have stars which also create light upon the earth. And by the way, you can actually navigate on a clear moonless night by the stars. It actually casts enough light upon the earth that you can actually move around. You can actually see. It's not completely dark. So why doesn't he just say sun and moon? Why say greater light and lesser light? Well, there's an answer to that question. Where did Moses spend the bulk of his upbringing? In Egypt. And who is the primary god of Egypt? Anybody know? Ra, the sun god. Moses explicitly, I think, and many commentators agree with me on this, specifically doesn't use the word sun and moon because of the massive amount of worship of those two bodies that existed in ancient pagan religions. And so instead of using their names, he simply calls them the greater light and the lesser light, instead of using sun and moon, or the Hebrew words for sun and moon. Because these are not to be worshipped as deities. They're just a greater light and a lesser light. Greater than each other, lesser than each other, because they're obviously being compared to one another, greater light, lesser light, right? They're being compared to each other. The idea is, I don't want to plant any idea in your minds here as we are going through this that somehow you make the mistake of thinking that God created two deities below himself that exists in the heavens. Don't make the mistake of being sun worshipers, which was a real problem amongst the Semitic peoples, both in the Mesopotamian Valley and in Egypt. So then we come to, okay, so that was the fourth day, but now we come to the fifth day. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves. That word great sea creatures is difficult to translate. Quite probably, most literally, it's the great sea monsters, or the great sea, it's called sea creatures here, but it's probably something of monstrous, powerful sea creatures. If you've ever seen a whale, you have seen a great and powerful sea creature. I would suggest to you that prior to the flood, there were probably significantly greater creatures in the sea than we know today. But nonetheless, it's some sort of creatures. So it's distinct in the sense of the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves with which the waters swarm according to their kinds. Again, notice how that matches the language of the plants. So each one has a distinction. And then every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply in the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. So you have God now very explicitly creating a different kind of life than plant life. In this case, what we would call, for lack of a better term, sentient life. Okay, sentience means self-awareness, so animals are technically not sentient, but many scientists will use the word sentient to describe creatures who can decide, in a sense, of what they want to do next. So a bird lands on the fence, and he's looking around, and he decides, in whatever process is going on in his brain, right? He's probably not using, language, but he makes a decision. I'm going to jump down and jump into that little pool of water and wash myself, and then he jumps down, and he flaps up, and then he jumps back up on the fence. The sense of making choices through whatever physical processes, electromagnetic processes in their brains and instinct and all these other kinds of things that give them the ability to move independently. Plants don't do that. A tree doesn't decide, I'm going to move over here. Right? It's there. It's in a place. So you have that sense here. God is moving from that which covers the earth as plant life. It's interesting, we call people who are in a coma in a vegetative state, right? There they are. Okay? It's there. But this is a different kind of life. This is a life that has a sense of movement, a sense of will, even, although that will might be very rudimentary, but it's there nonetheless. Okay? And it varies, of course, of different creatures, right? All kinds of different creatures have very different kinds of wills. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is the fact that what you have is, and I really do think that Moses underestimates himself in writing verse 21, because if you've ever watched documentaries about the life in the sea, the amount of life in the sea dwarfs the amount of life on land by a factor of 100, probably, in terms of the number of creatures and the types of creatures that are in the sea. The sea is massive. Now, there could have been many, many more types of birds and other kinds of things in the air prior to the flood. Much of that may have been destroyed by virtue of the flood. But if we take the Bible at its word that Noah brought in every kind of animal, well, they all came out of the ark too. But nonetheless, and of course many may have died since then, since the change of climate on the earth. But I think that this verse is the massive quantity of life that exists in the sea. And it's interesting, isn't it, that, I'm way past my time. The modern secular scientist has a tendency to think of the sea as sort of the birthplace of life. Well, where does he get that idea from? He gets it from here, in a sense, because it's like God creates this massive life in the sea first. The difference we would make, though, is where Don's going to pick up next week, which is that life on this planet that comes on the land is uniquely different from that which comes from the sea. And God's going to explicitly create that. So while a few of us are off at camp next week, Don is going to come, if you will be so generous, Don, and pick up at verse 24 and talk about the creation of animals upon the earth in day 6. So I'm going to give Don my favorite day of this narrative. I got to go talk about transubstantiation at camp. He gets to talk about the 6th day here. So I am deeply jealous, but I know he'll cover it well. What's that? It's all in who you know. All right, so that is our examination of this first 5 days of the creation. You'll see how it started relatively quickly. Each day went quickly, but then you notice how they're expanding as you go. So he gets the biggest day of the lot. And I'd appreciate it if you hold day 7 for me when I get back. Okay. I think you got enough to say in day 6 to take the whole hour.